My in-laws assaulted me during an ICE detention 2 years ago. So last night I told them I was being deported just to see if they'd brag about it. When I first came to America as a legal citizen, ICE detained me under the guise of suspicious behavior. The suspicious behavior in question? Walking around Soho and NYC with my hands in my pockets. But that wasn't even the worst part. While detained, they hurt me in ways I still don't feel comfortable speaking about. So I sued them, and I was so close to winning the case against them. All I needed was evidence that ICE agents were corrupt. And lucky for me, my in-laws all worked as deportation officers. So 2 nights ago, while my husband Jack and I sat at his parents' dinner table, I dropped the bomb I'd been rehearsing for weeks. Immigration called today. They're deporting me in 2 days. The champagne bottle my father-in-law was opening practically exploded with excitement. Finally, some good news. He laughed, not even trying to hide his joy. My mother-in-law started clapping. Actually clapping. My brother-in-law raised his beer like he was toasting my departure. The phone in my purse was recording everything. Jack's watch was too. We'd bought it specifically for this moment. I let my shoulders slump, making myself look defeated. I think you'll lose my income, I said quietly. I've been paying half your mortgage. That's when FIL's face twisted into something ugly. Your money? He was already getting defensive, exactly like we'd planned. I make $5,000 per deportation under the table. $10,000 to destroy papers. My mother-in-law jumped in, wine sloshing in her glass. 3 deportations funded Bianca's college. Your measly contributions mean nothing. Jack played his part perfectly, his voice confused and hurt. Mom, you said that money was from Dad's investments. It was an investment, she snapped back. In getting rid of parasites. I could feel my pulse in my throat, but I pushed forward with the next bait. You're lying. Federal agents have oversight. There are rules. My brother-in-law slammed his beer down so hard the table shook. Oversight? We are the oversight. His face was red now, the alcohol and anger mixing together. That Mexican teacher who reported us for targeting her students? We photoshopped gang tattoos onto her social media, planted drugs during a routine check of her car. But she had kids. Jack's voice was barely a whisper. Phil actually laughed at that. Now they're in foster care. Should have minded her business. My stomach was churning, but I needed more. I needed them to admit to everything. At least real criminals get deported, I said, injecting just enough righteousness into my voice. That's something good you do. The laughter that erupted from my father-in-law made my skin crawl. Real criminals? Your brother was born here. So were about 400 others we deported this year alone. The room felt like it was spinning. What? Destroy birth certificates, create fake criminal records. By the time they can prove anything, they're already gone. He was bragging now, chest puffed out like he was proud. Jack's rage bait was perfect. Dad, you always said those people were all illegal. And you believed me? Phil's contempt for his own son was visceral. You're even dumber than your wife. The words hung in the air like poison. I stood up, letting fake tears stream down my face. You know what? My case will expose all of you. Every single thing you've done. File's face went from smug to furious in seconds. Your case? You mean that fake assault claim? He was standing now too, towering over me. You think you're special? You think you're the only one? My whole body went cold. What do you mean? My detention center is a buffet. We take what we want. Jack's voice cracked. Dad, what are you saying? Phil pulled out his phone, swiping through it like he was looking for vacation photos. Your wife's cousin. Room 67B. She was my favorite. Your second cousin Blake said she was tighter than any white bitch he'd ever find on Tinder. He turned the screen toward me. A photo of my cousin Maria in a detention cell, crying. She was in there for 6 hours before we released her. No records, of course. Judge Coleman's son was there too that night. My legs felt like water. Maria had tried to tell me something happened to her 2 years ago, but she couldn't get the words out. That's why she took her life. I said coldly, the pieces clicking together. You're making this up to hurt me. Making it up? He was scrolling again. I have videos. Want to see yours from 2021? The one where you kept saying you were a citizen? He held the phone up. This is you, right? From that suspicious behavior detention? The room tilted. That's when Jack stood up, his whole act dropping instantly. Did you just confess to assaulting my wife? Jack's face went completely white like all the blood drained out of him in 1 second. The room froze and nobody moved or breathed for what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 seconds. Then Phil's eyes got huge and I watched him realize what Jack just said, and what it meant. He lunged across the table so fast his chair fell backward and crashed on the floor. His hands reached for my purse sitting on the chair next to me, and I could see his fingers stretching toward the strap. I grabbed the purse first and yanked it against my chest and turned toward the front door. My legs felt shaky, but I made them move and I ran. Jack jumped up and put himself between me and his father, and Phil slammed into him trying to get past. Mill started screaming at Jack, asking what he'd done and calling him a traitor and worse things I won't repeat. Bill pulled out his phone and started recording everything like he thought he could use it against us somehow, or maybe prove we set them up. I didn't stop to think about it. I just kept running for the door with my purse clutched so tight my fingers hurt. Jack shoved his father backward and Phil stumbled into the table and knocked over wine glasses that shattered on the floor. Mil grabbed Jack's arm trying to pull him back, but he twisted away from her and followed me. I got the front door open and ran outside into the cold night air. Our car was parked 3 houses down, and I ran toward it as fast as I could in the heels I wore to dinner. Jack caught up to me and pulled the keys from his pocket, and we both jumped in. He started the engine and pulled away from the curb before I even got my door fully closed. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold my phone. I pulled it out of my purse and the recording was still going, and I stopped it and saved the file. Then I tried to call Rhea Chopra, and my fingers kept missing the right buttons on the screen. Jack drove fast, turning corners and checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. He looked terrified, like he expected his family to appear behind us any moment. I finally got Rhea's number to dial, and she answered on the second ring even though it was late on a Saturday night. I started talking so fast the words all ran together and I wasn't making sense. I told her we got it and they confessed to everything, and FIL admitted to assaulting me and Maria and having videos and taking bribes and deporting citizens, and Jack confronted him and we barely got out. Rhea told me to slow down and breathe and tell her what happened. I tried to calm down enough to explain, but my voice kept shaking, and I had to stop twice because I thought I might throw up. Jack kept driving and checking the mirror, and his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Rhea listened to everything I said, and then she told us to come straight to her office right now, and it didn't matter that it was 8 p.m. on a Saturday. She said she needed to hear the recording immediately, and we needed to figure out next steps before FIL and his family had time to destroy evidence or come after us. Jack said okay and changed direction, heading toward downtown where Rhea's office was located. He kept checking the rearview mirror every 30 seconds, convinced his family was following us. I turned around and looked out the back window, but the streets behind us stayed empty. No headlights followed us, and no cars turned when we turned. But Jack couldn't stop checking, and his breathing was fast and shallow, like he might have a panic attack. We got to Rhea's office building and parked in the garage underneath. The building was mostly empty on a Saturday night, and our footsteps echoed in the concrete garage as we walked to the elevator. Rhea met us on the 3rd floor and took us straight to her conference room. She looked serious and focused and didn't waste time with small talk. I pulled out my phone and Jack took off his watch, and we both had recordings of the entire dinner. Rhea plugged my phone into her computer speakers and pressed play. The recording started with me saying immigration called and I was deported, and then FIL's excited reaction. We all sat there listening to the whole thing, and Rhea stopped it 3 times to replay sections where FIL admitted to specific crimes. The first time was when he said he makes $5,000 per deportation under the table and $10,000 to destroy papers. The second time was when he talked about the Mexican teacher and planting evidence on her. The third time was when he talked about Maria and showed me the photo and said his detention center was a buffet. Rhea's face got harder with each replay and her jaw clenched tight. When the recording got to the part where Phil admitted to having videos of assaulting me, she closed her eyes for a second and took a deep breath. Then she let the rest play through to the end where Jack asked if FIL just confessed to assaulting his wife. When it finished, Rhea sat back in her chair and was quiet for a minute. Then she said this changes everything about my case and goes way beyond civil court now. She explained that what we recorded wasn't just evidence for my lawsuit anymore, but proof of federal crimes including civil rights violations and corruption and organized criminal activity. She said we needed to contact the FBI immediately, because this was bigger than one assault case, or even one corrupt officer. This was a whole network of ICE agents committing crimes and violating people's rights and destroying lives. Rhea said she knew someone at the local FBI field office, and she was going to call them right now while we sat here. She picked up her office phone and dialed a number from memory and waited. Someone answered, and Rhea identified herself and said she had evidence of federal crimes being committed by ICE officers and needed to speak with someone immediately. She listened for a minute and then said yes. She understood this was unusual for a Saturday night, but this couldn't wait. She gave her name again and her bar number and said she was calling about civil rights violations and corruption. Then she waited on hold. Jack and I sat there not talking while Rhea waited. My hands finally stopped shaking, but I felt cold even though the office was warm. Jack reached over and held my hand, and his palm was sweaty. After about 5 minutes, someone came back on the line, and Rhea explained the situation briefly without giving too many details. She said she had a client who recorded ICE officers confessing to assault and corruption and illegal deportations, and she needed FBI involvement tonight. The person on the phone must have asked her questions because she answered yes several times and gave the address of her office. Then she hung up and told us an agent was coming right now and should be here within the hour. She said we were going to play the recording again for the FBI and they would decide how to proceed. Jack asked what would happen to his family, and Rhea said honestly, they were probably going to be arrested and charged with federal crimes. Jack nodded and didn't say anything, but his hand squeezed mine tighter. We waited in the conference room and Rhea ordered food delivery because none of us had eaten dinner. The food came and I tried to eat, but everything tasted like nothing, and I gave up after a few bites. Jack didn't eat either. Rhea made notes on a legal pad about everything we told her and asked us questions about the dinner and what led up to the recording. At 9:15, the receptionist's desk phone rang, and Rhea answered it and said to send them up. 2 people came into the conference room a minute later. The first was a woman in her 40s wearing jeans and an FBI jacket who introduced herself as Agent Wilhelmina Parsons. The second was a younger man also in FBI gear who she said was her partner. Agent Parsons shook our hands and sat down across from us at the conference table. She pulled out a notebook and pen and asked us to play the recording from the beginning. Rhea plugged my phone back into the speakers and started it over. Agent Parsons took notes through the whole thing, and her face never changed expression, but I noticed her pen pressed harder into the paper when FIL talked about the photos and videos. When the recording ended, she asked to hear it 2 more times and took more notes each time. Her partner also wrote things down and they whispered to each other a few times, but I couldn't hear what they said. When they finished listening, Agent Parsons closed her notebook and looked at me and Jack. She said this was serious evidence of federal crimes, and they were opening an investigation immediately. Then she said we needed to go somewhere safe tonight because Phil and his family would realize what we have and might try to intimidate us, or worse. Jack suggested we could get a hotel room, but Agent Parsons shook her head and said that was too easy to find. She said the FBI had safe locations they used for witnesses, and she was going to arrange for us to stay at one tonight. She made a phone call and talked quietly for a few minutes and then hung up. She told us to gather anything we needed from home but to be quick about it, and her partner would follow us there and then to the safe house. Rhea said she would start filing emergency motions first thing Monday morning and would be in touch. We left her office and drove home with the FBI partner following behind us in his car. At our house, we packed bags as fast as we could, throwing in clothes and toiletries and phone chargers. The whole time I kept looking out the windows expecting to see Phil's car pull up, but nothing happened and we left after 20 minutes. The FBI partner led us to an apartment building in a neighborhood I didn't recognize on the other side of the city. The apartment was on the 4th floor and was plain and generic with basic furniture and nothing personal anywhere. Agent Parsons met us there with another agent, and they did a sweep of the apartment checking all the rooms and windows. Then they told us 2 agents would stay with us through the night in shifts, and we should try to get some rest. They set up in the living room with laptops and communication equipment. Jack and I went into the bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the bed and just stared at the wall. Everything that happened kept playing in my head on repeat. Phil's face when he showed me Maria's photo. His voice saying his detention center was a buffet. The way he scrolled through his phone looking for the video of me. I couldn't make it stop. Jack tried to get me to lie down, but I couldn't. I just sat there replaying Phil's words about Maria and about me and about the 400 citizens they deported. 400 people who were born here and had their lives destroyed by Phil and his unit. 400 families torn apart. And Maria, who couldn't live with what they did to her. Jack sat next to me on the bed and finally he broke down crying. His whole body shook and tears ran down his face and he couldn't stop. He kept saying he was sorry over and over like it was his fault. He said his whole family were monsters and he never knew the extent of what they were doing. He knew they were harsh, and he knew they didn't like immigrants, but he never imagined they were raping people and destroying documents and taking bribes to deport citizens. I put my arms around him and told him it wasn't his fault. I reminded him that he was the one who helped me get the evidence we needed. He was the one who came up with the plan to record them, and he was the one who played his part perfectly at dinner, and he was the one who blocked his father, so I could escape with the recording. Without him, none of this would have happened, and Phil and the others would still be out there hurting people. Jack cried harder and said he should have known something was wrong and he should have questioned things more. But I told him that his family lied to him his whole life and manipulated him and he couldn't have known. What mattered now was that we had evidence and the FBI was involved and his family was going to face consequences for what they did. Sunday morning, Agent Parsons knocked on the apartment door at 8 and came in with an older man in a suit and another federal prosecutor who introduced himself as Conrad Parsons. He shook my hand and Jack's hand and explained he was Agent Parsons' husband and would be handling the criminal prosecution side of the case. They set up laptops on the kitchen table and asked us to sit down because they needed to go through everything again and build a timeline of what we knew versus what we could actually prove in court. Conrad pulled out a legal pad and started writing down dates and names while Agent Parsons played sections of the recording and paused it to ask us questions about specific people Phil mentioned. They worked through the whole thing for 2 hours asking about the Mexican teacher and the 400 deported citizens and Maria and Blake and every single detail Phil had bragged about at dinner. Conrad explained that the recording was powerful evidence, but they needed to verify the claims about destroyed documents and planted evidence and other victims, because defense attorneys would argue Phil was just drunk and making things up to hurt me. He asked if I knew how to contact Maria's family or my second cousin Blake, who Phil mentioned in the recording. My stomach dropped because I hadn't talked to my aunt since Maria's funeral 8 months ago, and I didn't know how to tell her that my husband's family were the ones who assaulted her daughter. Conrad saw my face and said he understood this was hard, but Maria's mother might have information about what happened to Maria in detention that could help build the case. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and found my aunt's number and pressed call before I could change my mind. She answered on the 3rd ring asking if everything was okay because I never called her anymore. I told her I needed to talk to her about Maria and about what happened to her in the detention center 2 years ago. My aunt went quiet for a long time and then asked why I was bringing this up now after all these months. I closed my eyes and forced the words out, telling her that I had evidence about who hurt Maria and that those people were my in-laws who worked as deportation officers at the facility where Maria was held. My aunt started crying immediately, and I could hear her trying to catch her breath between sobs. She said she always knew something terrible happened to Maria in that detention center, because Maria came home different and wouldn't talk about it and started having nightmares every night. She said Maria tried to tell her once but couldn't get the words out and just cried for hours in her arms. My aunt asked if I was sure it was my husband's family, and I told her yes, and that we had recorded them confessing to what they did. She cried harder and said she didn't know whether to thank me or hate me for being connected to the people who destroyed her daughter. I told her I was sorry, and that I was working with the FBI to make sure they went to prison for what they did to Maria and to other people. My aunt was quiet again, and then said Maria would want justice even if it came too late to save her. She gave me Blake's phone number and told me to make sure these people never hurt anyone else again. I thanked her and hung up and sat there staring at my phone while Jack rubbed my back and Conrad wrote down notes about what my aunt had said. I dialed Blake's number and it rang 4 times before he picked up. I told him who I was and that I needed to talk to him about what happened to him in ICE detention 2 years ago. Blake went completely silent and I could hear him breathing on the other end, but he didn't say anything for a full minute. Then he asked how I knew about that and why I was calling him now. I explained that my in-laws worked as deportation officers and that they had confessed to assaulting detainees including him and that the FBI was investigating. Blake's voice changed and got harder, and he said he reported what happened to him, but ICE investigators told him there was no evidence and his complaint went nowhere. He said they made him feel like he was lying or making it up for attention. I told him the FBI wanted to hear his story and that this time people would believe him because we had evidence. Blake was quiet again and then said he wanted to meet with the FBI and give a statement about what FIL and BIL did to him. His voice sounded angry and relieved at the same time, like he'd been waiting 2 years for someone to finally believe him and take him seriously. Conrad took the phone and talked to Blake directly and set up a meeting for that afternoon at the FBI field office. Monday morning, Agent Parsons called and said the FBI had opened a full investigation into the ICE detention facility where FIL worked and the entire deportation unit. She said they were moving fast because they were worried about evidence destruction now that FIL knew he was recorded and might try to warn his colleagues or delete files. Jack's phone had been blowing up with calls and texts from his family since Saturday night, and he showed me the screen with 43 missed calls and dozens of text messages. His mother had sent 47 texts calling me horrible names and threatening to destroy me in court for entrapment and fraud. She said I had manipulated Jack into betraying his family, and that she would make sure I paid for ruining their lives. Jack blocked all their numbers and told Agent Parsons about the threats, and she said that was witness intimidation, and she would handle it. Rhea called that same morning and said she was filing an emergency motion in my civil case to preserve all evidence and prevent ICE from destroying documents related to the detention facility and deportation cases. She said the motion would ask the judge to order federal marshals to secure the facility's records immediately before anyone could shred files or delete computer data. 2 hours later, Rhea called back and said the judge granted the motion immediately, and federal marshals were already at the detention facility securing all the records and computer servers. That same day, 3 more people came forward after Blake posted something vague on social media about finally being heard and finally getting justice. Agent Parsons interviewed all 3 of them at the FBI office and called me afterward to say their stories matched the pattern of abuse and corruption that FIL had described in the recording. One of the new witnesses was a woman named Evelyn Knight, who had been detained in the same facility as me in 2021. Agent Parsons put her on speakerphone, and Evelyn told me she saw FIL take me into a separate room, and she heard me crying and screaming, but guards told her to mind her business or she would be next. Evelyn said she had nightmares about not helping me, and about what might have happened to her if she had tried to intervene. She said she was so glad I was finally getting justice, and that she wanted to testify about everything she witnessed that day. Tuesday morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with alerts from Agent Parsons saying the raids were happening right now. Jack and I sat on the couch in the safe house watching the local news with the security detail standing behind us. The reporter was outside FIL's house, and I could see FBI agents carrying boxes out the front door, while neighbors stood on their lawns recording everything on their phones. Then the camera caught FIL being walked out in handcuffs, and his face was red and angry, and he was yelling something the microphone couldn't pick up. Mayel came out next, and she was screaming at the cameras and pointing at the reporters like they were the ones who did something wrong. The news switched to BIL's apartment building where more FBI agents were loading evidence bags into vans. Jack's hand was shaking when he reached for his coffee, and I could tell watching his family get arrested was harder than he thought it would be, even though he knew it was coming. The detention facility raid made the news too, and they showed ICE supervisors being escorted out while employees stood around looking confused and scared. Agent Parsons called an hour later and said they found exactly what they were looking for and more. She asked if I could come to the FBI office that afternoon because they needed me to identify some evidence. Rhea met us there, and we sat in a conference room while Agent Parsons brought in FIL's laptop in an evidence bag. She explained they found a hidden folder with hundreds of files, and some of them matched what FIL described at the dinner. She said I didn't have to look at the video of my assault, but they needed me to confirm it was me for the case. My stomach dropped because I knew I had to do this, but I really didn't want to see what they did to me 2 years ago. Rhea asked if I wanted her to stay, and I said yes because I didn't think I could handle it alone. Agent Parsons set up the laptop and opened a video file and warned me it was going to be hard to watch. The video started and I saw myself in the detention cell wearing the orange jumpsuit they made me change into. I was crying and telling them I was a citizen and asking them to call my husband. Then FIL walked into the frame and 2 other officers I didn't recognize were with him. I had to watch them hurt me and listen to myself begging them to stop and saying I had rights and asking why they were doing this. The whole video was 11 minutes long and I made it through 6 minutes before I had to tell Agent Parsons to stop it. I confirmed it was me, and then I ran to the bathroom and threw up until there was nothing left in my stomach. I sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes trying to breathe and stop shaking. Rhea came in and sat next to me and didn't say anything, just stayed there while I cried. Jack found me there and got down on the floor and pulled me against him. He kept saying we could stop this whole thing right now if I wanted to, and that my safety and mental health were more important than any case. I told him no, because we weren't stopping until every single one of them was in prison, and I meant it, even though seeing that video made everything feel raw and real again, in a way I wasn't ready for. We went back to the conference room and Agent Parsons said they found other evidence on the laptop too. FIL had kept detailed records of every bribe he took going back 7 years with names and amounts and dates all written down in a spreadsheet. Conrad came in and explained that FIL was apparently worried about his partners turning on him, so he documented everything as insurance to protect himself. The records showed payments ranging from $3,000 to $15,000 per deportation, depending on how complicated the case was. There were notes about destroying birth certificates and creating fake criminal records and planting evidence during arrests. Conrad said this was the kind of evidence that could bring down the entire deportation unit, and maybe even some of the supervisors who had to know what was happening. Wednesday morning, Conrad called and said a federal grand jury was being put together to hear evidence for criminal charges. He explained it would take a few weeks to present everything, but he was confident they would charge FIL, MIL, BIL, and at least 6 other ICE officers based on what they found. The charges would include civil rights violations, corruption, assault, fraud, and conspiracy. Jack's phone rang that afternoon and the caller ID said Bianca. He stared at it for 3 rings before answering and putting it on speaker. Bianca was crying so hard she could barely talk, and she kept saying she had no idea what their parents were doing. Jack didn't believe her at first, and asked how she could not know when she lived with them through college. Bianca said she would prove it and sent him screenshots of her bank statements showing no weird deposits or payments from their parents. The only money she got was normal birthday and Christmas checks that any parents might give. Then Bianca told Jack that their parents paid for her college with cash deposits over 4 years, and the total was about $45,000. She said they told her it was from their savings account, and she never questioned it, because why would she think her parents were taking bribes to destroy people's lives? Jack asked if she knew about the deportations and the fake evidence, and Bianca said no and started crying again. She said she thought their parents were just normal ICE officers doing their jobs, and she never imagined they were hurting people on purpose. The defense attorneys started a media campaign calling the whole investigation a witch hunt. They went on TV saying the recording was obtained illegally, and that we tricked FIL into making false statements. One lawyer said I seduced FIL and manipulated the situation to make him look bad. Rhea was so angry when she saw that interview that she called the local news station and asked to come on and respond. She went on TV that night and explained very clearly that recording someone confessing to crimes in your own home is completely legal in our state. She said the defense was trying to distract from the real evidence, which included videos and photos and detailed records of corruption. Rhea looked directly at the camera and said that blaming victims for exposing abuse was exactly what these officers did to keep people quiet for years. I started seeing a therapist named Bernadette who works with people who went through trauma from institutions and assault. Our first session was hard because I didn't really want to talk about anything and just sat there crying. Bernadette said that was completely normal and we would go at whatever pace I could handle. She explained that trauma therapy wasn't about forcing me to relive everything right away, but about building tools to process what happened when I was ready. She asked me what I needed most right now, and I said I needed to stop seeing that video every time I closed my eyes. Bernadette taught me a breathing technique and said we would work on that together over the next few weeks. By the end of week 2, the FBI had identified 47 citizens who were illegally deported by FIL's unit. Conrad called us at the safe house and explained his team was working with officials in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to locate these people and bring them back. He said they were offering witness protection to anyone willing to testify about what happened to them. Some of the victims had been gone for over 3 years and built new lives in countries they'd never been to before. Conrad's voice was tired when he told us that finding everyone would take months because FIL's unit had scattered people across 4 countries and destroyed most of the records. The FBI was working with birth certificate databases and school records to prove these people were actually citizens. Jack started having panic attacks around this time. The first one happened while we were eating breakfast at the safe house, and Conrad called with an update about another victim they'd found. Jack's hands started shaking so bad he dropped his coffee mug and it shattered on the floor. He couldn't breathe right and kept saying he couldn't believe his father destroyed so many lives. I had to walk him through the breathing technique Bernadette taught me until he could calm down enough to talk. He kept apologizing like any of this was his fault. I reminded him that he chose to help me expose them instead of protecting them, and that choice mattered more than anything his family did. He could have warned them about the recording or refused to help me set up the dinner, but he didn't. The grand jury handed down indictments 3 weeks after the arrests. FIL, MIL, BIL, and 8 other ICE officers were charged with federal crimes including civil rights violations, corruption, assault, fraud, and conspiracy. Conrad explained the charges in detail over the phone and said the bail would be set extremely high because all of them were considered flight risks. They had connections through their work that could help them disappear if they wanted to run. The bail hearing happened 2 days later and Conrad invited us to attend, but said we didn't have to if it was too hard. Jack wanted to go, so we sat in the back of the courtroom while FIL's attorney argued he wasn't a flight risk. The attorney talked about FIL's ties to the community and his years of service, and made him sound like some kind of hero. Then Conrad stood up and presented evidence that FIL had been researching countries without extradition treaties with the United States. He'd looked up how to get fake passports and searched for property rentals in Paraguay and Belarus. The judge denied bail immediately, and FIL completely lost it right there in court. He started screaming that we would pay for this and that he'd make sure we suffered for what we did. 2 marshals had to drag him out while he was still yelling threats. Jack's face went white watching his father get pulled from the courtroom. Miles' bail hearing was different because her attorney argued she was less involved than FEL in the actual assaults. The evidence showed she took bribes and helped with the deportation fraud, but she wasn't directly involved in the physical abuse. The judge set her bail at $500,000 and said she had to wear an ankle monitor and surrender her passport. Someone posted her bail that same day, and by that evening she was already calling Jack's phone. He let the first few calls go to voicemail, but she kept calling every 20 minutes. Finally, he listened to one of the messages and put it on speaker so I could hear. MIL was crying and begging Jack to recant his testimony. She said I had manipulated him and poisoned his mind against his family. She said if he really loved his parents, he would tell the truth about how I forced him to help me. The message ended with her saying she knew he was a good son deep down, and he would do the right thing. Jack blocked her number after the 6th voicemail came through. This one was different from the others because MIL wasn't crying anymore. Her voice was cold when she said she hoped I got deported for real this time, and that Jack would realize what a mistake he made choosing me over his family. Jack's hands were shaking when he played it for Agent Parsons the next morning. She traced the call and went to MIL's house that afternoon to warn her that witness intimidation would violate her bail conditions. Agent Parsons told us later that MIL acted shocked and said she was just a mother trying to reach her son. 3 weeks after the arrests, an investigative journalist named Tucker Allen published a major story about the corruption network. The article had details from the court filings and interviews with some of the victims who'd already come forward. Tucker wrote about the 400 citizens who were illegally deported and the system of bribes that funded it all. He included information about the photos and videos FIL kept and the fake evidence BIL planted. The story went viral within hours, and suddenly my phone was ringing with reporters wanting interviews. Rhea called me that same morning and told me absolutely not to talk to anyone until after the trial. She said anything I said publicly could be used against us, and we needed to let the evidence speak for itself. The publicity from Tucker's article brought forward 12 more victims who were assaulted or illegally deported by FIL's unit. Conrad's team was completely overwhelmed trying to interview everyone and build cases against all the defendants. He told us he was working 16-hour days just trying to keep up with all the new evidence and witness statements coming in. Some of the new victims had been too scared to come forward before, but seeing the arrests made them feel like someone would finally listen. Judge Irving Blanton, who was handling my civil case, decided to consolidate it with the other victims' cases into one large lawsuit against ICE and the specific officers. Rhea explained this made our case much stronger because it showed a clear pattern of abuse instead of isolated incidents. She said having dozens of victims with similar stories would make it impossible for ICE to claim these were just a few bad officers. The consolidated lawsuit meant we'd all share attorneys and resources, which would make the case easier to manage. Jack and I were finally allowed to go home after a month in witness protection. The FBI installed security cameras around our house and a new alarm system that connected directly to the local police station. Agent Parsons gave us her personal cell number and said to call immediately if anything felt wrong or if FIL's family tried to contact us. That first night back, I couldn't sleep in our bedroom. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that dinner and what Phil said about Maria and about me. I kept seeing his face when he showed me that photo of Maria crying in the detention cell. Jack found me at 3 a.m, sitting on the couch in the living room with all the lights on. He sat down next to me, and we just stayed there together until the sun came up. The next week, I started seeing Bernadette twice a week for EMDR therapy to process what happened in that detention center and watching the video of it. She had me follow her fingers with my eyes while thinking about specific moments from the assault, and it felt like my brain was rewiring itself in real time. The first few sessions left me so drained I could barely drive home, and sometimes I'd sit in her parking lot for 20 minutes just staring at nothing. Bernadette kept saying this was normal, and that feeling worse before feeling better was part of the healing process, but it didn't make those drives home any easier. During one session, I broke down crying so hard I couldn't catch my breath. When a memory surfaced of FIL's face right before he hurt me, and Bernadette had to pause everything and help me ground myself by naming 5 things I could see in her office. The therapy was working, though, because I could finally sleep for more than 2 hours without waking up in a panic, and the nightmares were happening less often. 3 weeks into therapy, Conrad called with news that made Jack actually smile for the first time in days. The detention facility where FIL worked was being shut down temporarily, while a federal review team investigated the conditions and how detainees were treated. Conrad said this almost never happens because these facilities usually just get fines or warnings, but the evidence we provided was so bad they had no choice. He told us this was a huge victory because it meant real consequences for the entire system that enabled FIL and the others to hurt people. The facility shutdown made the local news, and I watched the footage of ICE officers carrying boxes out of the building, while reporters talked about the corruption investigation. Seeing that building empty felt like a small piece of justice for Maria and everyone else who suffered there. Back in therapy, I told Bernadette about Maria and how guilty I felt that I didn't know what happened to her before she took her life 2 years ago. I kept thinking if I'd pushed harder to get her to talk, or if I'd been more aware of what my in-laws were capable of, maybe I could have helped her. Bernadette listened and then reminded me that Maria's death wasn't my fault, and that I couldn't have known what FIL did to her when Maria herself couldn't find the words to tell anyone. She said I was honoring Maria's memory now by making sure her abusers faced justice, and that mattered more than beating myself up over things I couldn't have changed. It helped hearing that, even though the guilt didn't completely go away. Blake showed up at our house one Saturday afternoon with flowers and a card thanking us for believing him and helping him get justice. He looked different from I remembered, less broken somehow, and he told us he'd been in therapy too since giving his statement to the FBI. Blake said finally being heard by people who took him seriously helped him start healing after 2 years of feeling invisible, and like what happened to him didn't matter. We sat in the living room for 2 hours while he talked about his therapy process and how hard it was to trust anyone in authority now. Jack made coffee, and we all just existed together in that space of shared trauma and slow recovery. Before Blake left, he hugged me and said he was glad I married into that family because it meant someone was finally there to expose them. Evelyn and I started talking more after she testified to the FBI, and we realized we had almost identical experiences in that detention facility. We met for coffee 1 week after my therapy session, and within an hour we decided to start a support group for other survivors of ICE detention abuse. The first meeting was just me, Evelyn, and 3 other people who'd come forward after the arrests, but by the 4th week we had 12 members. Meeting every Wednesday in a community center basement and having people who understood exactly what we went through made everything feel less isolating. Nobody had to explain why certain sounds triggered panic attacks, or why we couldn't watch cop shows anymore, because everyone just knew. The preliminary hearings started 3 months after the arrests, and I had to sit in court while FIL's attorney stood up and tried to discredit the recording. He claimed I seduced FIL into making false statements, and that the whole dinner was a setup to frame an innocent man. Rhea shot out of her seat so fast her chair rolled backward and she objected before he could finish his sentence. The judge looked annoyed and shut down that entire line of questioning immediately, saying the recording spoke for itself, and the defense could present their case without victim blaming. FIL sat at the defense table smirking like he thought this was all going to blow over, and it made my stomach turn. Jack testified the next day about planning the dinner recording with me, and the prosecutor asked him why he would betray his own family like this. Jack looked directly at his father across the courtroom and said, because they're criminals who hurt innocent people, including his wife, and he wasn't going to protect rapists just because they shared his DNA. FIL's face went red and he started whispering urgently to his attorney, but Jack kept talking about how finding out what his family really did made him physically sick. The jury was watching Jack closely, and I could see some of them nodding slightly like they understood his position. FIL's attorney cross-examined Jack next and tried to suggest I brainwashed him or threatened him into betraying his family. Jack stayed completely calm and explained that finding out his family were rapists and corrupt officers who destroyed hundreds of lives made him sick, and that's why he helped record the confession. He said no amount of family loyalty could make him protect people who assaulted detainees and took bribes to illegally deport citizens. The jury looked sympathetic to Jack, and several of them were glaring at the defense attorney for even suggesting Jack was manipulated. One older woman on the jury actually shook her head in disgust when the attorney kept pushing that angle. My turn to testify came 2 days later, and I had to describe in detail what FIL and the other officers did to me during that detention in 2021. Rhea had prepared me for this by doing practice runs where she asked me the hardest questions so I'd be ready, but actually saying everything out loud in front of strangers was horrible. I focused on the court reporter typing everything I said and tried not to look at FIL. While I explained how they held me for 6 hours in that room, and what they did to me while I kept telling them I was a legal citizen. My voice shook a few times, but I got through the entire testimony without breaking down, and Rhea squeezed my hand when I stepped down from the witness stand. The defense played the dinner recording during their case, trying to claim I was manipulating FIL into saying things that weren't true. But it completely backfired because the jury had to sit there and listen to FIL bragging about assaulting detainees and destroying evidence and taking bribes for illegal deportations. His voice on that recording was so proud and excited, talking about the 400 citizens he deported and the photos he kept and what he did to Maria. Several jurors looked physically ill, and one woman actually put her hand over her mouth like she might throw up. The defense attorney tried to argue that FIL was drunk and I was leading him on, but you could hear in the recording how eager FIL was to brag about everything he'd done. Blake took the stand the next day, and I could see his hands shaking from where I sat in the gallery. Conrad asked him to describe what happened during his detention, and Blake's voice started strong but got quieter with each detail about how BIL cornered him in the holding area and what happened after the other guards left. When Conrad asked him to explain what BIL did to him specifically, Blake broke down completely, his whole body shaking while he tried to get the words out through tears. The judge called an immediate recess, and I watched 2 jurors in the front row wipe their eyes while Blake was escorted out by the bailiff. During the break, Jack squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, but I didn't pull away because we both needed something to hold on to after hearing Blake describe the same kind of violence I went through. When court resumed, Blake finished his testimony, and the defense attorney barely cross-examined him, because even they could see the jury was done listening to anyone attack a crying assault victim. Evelyn testified 2 days later about being detained in the same facility as me back in 2021. She told the jury she watched FIL take me into a separate room away from the main holding area and heard me screaming and crying for help. Conrad asked why she didn't report it, and Evelyn started crying too, while explaining how guards surrounded her afterward and told her if she said anything about what she heard, they'd make sure she never left detention. She described having nightmares for 2 years about not helping me, about hearing my voice begging them to stop and doing nothing because she was too scared of what they'd do to her. The jury was completely silent during her testimony, and I saw several of them staring at FIL with disgust written all over their faces. When the defense tried to suggest she was making up her story to get attention, Evelyn looked directly at Fael and said she wished she was making it up, because then she could sleep at night without hearing me scream in her dreams. The prosecution presented the laptop evidence the following week, and the courtroom went dead quiet, while Conrad explained what investigators found in the hidden folder. The jury didn't see the actual photos or videos, but Conrad described in clinical detail how FIL organized and categorized files by date, location, and victim name, including mine from 2021. He explained how FIL kept videos of assaults spanning back 6 years and had created a rating system for the files based on what he did to each person. Several jurors looked physically sick, and one older man in the back row kept shaking his head in disbelief, while Conrad walked through the folder structure and file names. The technical specialist testified about how the files were deliberately hidden and password protected, which showed FIL knew what he was doing was criminal and wanted to keep evidence for himself. FIL's attorney objected repeatedly, trying to keep the laptop evidence out, but the judge overruled every objection and allowed Conrad to present the full scope of what was found on that computer. Conrad entered FIL's bribe records into evidence the next day, showing 7 years of detailed payments for illegal deportations and document destruction. The records listed specific amounts, dates, and case numbers for each deportation, along with notes about which documents FIL destroyed to make the deportations possible. Conrad walked the jury through case after case where American citizens were deported after FIL destroyed their birth certificates and created fake criminal records to justify the removal. One case involved a teacher born in Texas who was deported to Mexico after FIL photoshopped gang tattoos onto her social media and planted substances in her car during a traffic stop. Another case showed a construction worker from California who was deported after FIL destroyed his birth certificate and claimed he admitted to being undocumented, even though recordings proved he never said that. The jury took notes through the entire presentation, and I could see them getting angrier, as Conrad revealed more cases of citizens torn from their families based on FIL's manufactured evidence. The trial lasted 6 weeks total, and by the end I was completely exhausted from reliving everything and watching the defense attorneys try to destroy our credibility every single day. They suggested I seduced FIL, that I manipulated Jack, that the other victims were lying for money, that the recordings were edited, that everything was part of some elaborate conspiracy against innocent officers just doing their jobs. Jack and I leaned on each other and our support system to get through each day of testimony and cross-examination. Rhea sat with us during breaks and reminded us why we were doing this when the defense got particularly cruel. Bernadette did extra therapy sessions to help me process the daily trauma of sitting in that courtroom. Some days I wanted to give up and let them win, but then I'd think about Maria and Blake and Evelyn and all the others whose lives FIL destroyed, and I'd force myself to go back the next day. The jury deliberated for 3 days after closing arguments, which Conrad said was normal for such a complex case with multiple defendants and charges. I could barely eat or sleep during those 3 days waiting for the verdict, and kept imagining scenarios where they found everyone not guilty, and all of this was for nothing. Jack was just as anxious, and we spent most of the time sitting on our couch in silence because there was nothing left to say that we hadn't already said 100 times. Bernadette did an emergency session with me on day 2 of deliberations to help manage my anxiety and taught me breathing exercises to use when the panic got too bad. On the 3rd day, Conrad called to say the jury had reached a verdict, and we needed to get to the courthouse immediately. The jury found FIL guilty on all counts, including civil rights violations, assault, corruption, fraud, and conspiracy. The forewoman read each verdict out loud, and FIL's face got redder with every guilty verdict, until I thought he might explode right there in the courtroom. They found MIL guilty on corruption and conspiracy charges, but not guilty on assault charges, because the evidence showed she wasn't directly involved in the physical abuse, even though she knew about it and helped cover it up. Mill started crying when the verdicts were read, but I felt zero sympathy for her after everything she said at that dinner, and everything she helped her husband do for years. The courtroom stayed completely silent except for the forewoman's voice reading through all the counts and verdicts for each defendant. BIL was found guilty on assault and corruption charges, and 5 of the other officers were convicted on various charges ranging from civil rights violations to evidence tampering. 2 officers were acquitted because the evidence against them was weaker than the evidence against the others, and Conrad told us afterward, that's just how the system works sometimes. Not everyone who deserves to be convicted gets convicted because the burden of proof is high and sometimes the evidence just isn't strong enough. I was disappointed about those 2 acquittals, but Conrad reminded me that getting convictions on the main perpetrators, including FIL, was a massive victory that almost never happens in cases like this. Sentencing happened 2 months later in the same courtroom where the trial took place. FIL got 23 years in federal prison, which Conrad said was one of the longest sentences he'd seen for these types of crimes. Mill got 8 years and Bill got 15 years. The other convicted officers got sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years depending on their level of involvement and the severity of their specific crimes. I watched each of them stand up as the judge read their sentences, and not one of them looked sorry for what they did to all those people whose lives they destroyed. Judge Blanton made a statement before the sentencing calling the crimes a betrayal of public trust and human dignity. He said the sentences reflected the severity of abusing power to harm vulnerable people who were already in frightening situations and had no way to defend themselves or report what was happening to them. He talked about how these officers took an oath to protect people and instead used their positions to assault, exploit, and illegally deport citizens and immigrants alike for personal gain. FIL showed no remorse through the entire sentencing hearing and glared at me and Jack like we were the criminals instead of him and his family, who spent years ruining lives for money and their own sick pleasure. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Rhea called to say ICE wanted to settle the civil case instead of going to trial because the criminal convictions made them look terrible and they didn't want more bad publicity. She met with their attorneys for 2 days straight, negotiating numbers and terms, and finally got them to agree to $2 million for me, plus substantial settlements for Blake and Evelyn and the other victims who joined the lawsuit. I sat in Rhea's office while she explained the settlement terms and showed me where to sign, and my hands shook holding the pen because $2 million felt impossible after everything we'd been through. The money hit my account a week later, and I stared at the number on my phone screen for probably 10 minutes trying to make it feel real. It didn't fix what FIL did to me or bring Maria back or erase the nightmares I still had most nights, but it meant I could afford therapy without worrying about bills, and it gave me security I'd never had before. I donated $300,000 to organizations that help deportation victims, and another $200,000 to groups pushing for detention reform, because I wanted some of that money to actually help people instead of just sitting in my account. Jack and I started marriage counseling the next month because the trial and everything with his family put serious strain on our relationship, even though we both wanted to stay together. Our counselor had us come twice a week at first, and we spent those sessions talking about trust and guilt and how to rebuild our life when his parents destroyed so many others. Jack cried through most of the early sessions because he felt responsible for his family's crimes, even though I kept telling him he helped expose them instead of protecting them. 4 months after the sentencing, Bianca sent Jack a text asking if they could meet to talk, and he stared at his phone for an hour trying to decide what to do. He finally agreed, but only if I came with him, and only in a public place where we felt safe. We met her at a coffee shop downtown, and she looked awful like she hadn't slept in weeks, and she told Jack she wanted a relationship with him separate from their parents. Jack was hesitant and asked her a lot of hard questions about what she knew and when she knew it, and Bianca answered everything honestly, including admitting she should have questioned where the college money came from. They started meeting once a month with me there as a buffer, and slowly rebuilt something that looked like a sibling relationship, based on truth about what their parents did, instead of the lies they grew up believing. 6 weeks after our first meeting with Bianca, Conrad called with news that the detention facility where FIL worked was being permanently shut down. The Federal Review found so many problems with oversight and detainee treatment that they couldn't justify keeping it open, and all the detainees were being transferred to facilities with better supervision. Conrad told me this almost never happens because the government usually just implements reforms and moves on, but our case created enough public pressure that they had to take real action. 6 months after the verdicts, I was doing better overall, but still had hard days where the trauma felt as fresh as it did 2 years ago. I'd wake up from nightmares about the detention center, or see someone who looked like FIL, and spend the rest of the day anxious and unable to focus. Bernadette reminded me during our sessions that healing isn't a straight line, and I was making real progress even when it didn't feel like it. The support group Evelyn and I started kept growing, and by month 7 we had 23 members meeting every week to share our experiences and support each other. We partnered with advocacy organizations to push for detention reform legislation, and turned our trauma into activism, because it helped me feel like Maria's death and our suffering might actually prevent future abuse. Jack got offered a job at a nonprofit that provides legal services to immigrants, and he came home, so excited, telling me he wanted to spend his career helping people his family hurt. I was proud of him for choosing to be part of the solution, instead of running away from his family's crimes like he could have. A year after the trial, Tucker published a follow-up story about the institutional changes and reforms that resulted from our case. He interviewed me for 2 hours, and I talked about Maria and Blake and Evelyn and all the other victims, and how we were working to make sure this never happened to anyone else. The article ran with photos of the closed detention facility, and quotes from Conrad about how rare it was to see real systemic change. 2 weeks after Tucker's article published, I got an acceptance letter from a graduate program for social work, so I could professionally help other survivors of institutional abuse and trauma. Rhea wrote me a recommendation letter calling me one of the strongest people she'd ever met, and that letter probably got me into the program more than my actual application. 3 weeks later, Jack and I loaded our car with everything we owned and drove 6 hours to the new city where my grad program started in the fall. The apartment we rented was small, but it had good light, and neither of us had any memories attached to the walls or the streets outside. Jack started his job at the Immigrant Legal Services nonprofit the same week I began orientation, and we'd come home tired but talking about the people we'd helped that day, instead of the trial or his family. We bought new furniture together and hung pictures on the walls, and it felt like we were building something that belonged to us, instead of living in the shadow of what his parents did. On the 2-year anniversary of Maria's death, I drove back to our old city with my aunt, and we went to the cemetery together, carrying a flat of purple flowers, because those were Maria's favorite. We knelt in the grass by her headstone, and I dug small holes with a hand trowel, while my aunt placed each plant carefully in the dirt. I told Maria out loud that Phil was in prison, and that we'd gotten justice for her, and that I was going to spend my whole life making sure other people didn't suffer the way she did. My aunt reached over and pulled me into a hug that smelled like her lavender perfume, and she said Maria would be so proud of me for being brave enough to fight back when it mattered most. We watered the flowers and sat there for a while in the quiet, and I felt like maybe Maria could finally rest now, knowing that the people who hurt her would never hurt anyone else again.